Well, here we are, back in Cool Mountain. Now that the model's all set up and it technically launches in-game, we can make adjustments and get this drivable model turned into a functioning track. Alright, so the first order of business is to shrink down the model quite drastically, since it's kinda insanely huge right now. So I brought it down by 40% and made sure to put the kart starting point back in place. This is a lot closer to a normal Mario Kart DS track. Unless you happen to fall off the edge. Alright, so falling off from up here probably shouldn't be able to happen. I do think it would be cool to have that falling risk always present, but with the way that the lap paths are going to be set up, I don't think that that can work anywhere but the bottom of the track. So I set up some guardrails on the edge of the track up here, as well as that ice path. Then I tested the track and went flying right through the rails, cause the normals are backwards. So I flipped the normals on the rails anywhere that they faced outward instead of inward. I also widened out this turn here, since it's a little too sharp to get around without hitting the wall. The worst part about making these kinds of little changes is the lengthy re-importing process. You've got to export the IMD file as well as the OBJ file for the collision map. Then you've got to split the IMD file into the model and texture files, and then put those into their respective places in the game files. Once I got the model updated in Mario Kart Toolbox, I tried placing a snowy tree like the ones you see in DK Pass, but it was just a red square. It looks like this is going to be slightly more in-depth than just placing whatever you want, so I'll come back to this after getting the essentials set up. I watched through the final part of Altair Yoshi's tutorial playlist, which covered the basics of getting a track working properly, which seems to be mostly about setting up different kinds of paths along your track, like a path for CPU enemies to drive on, a path for items to travel along, a path for the actual race's boundaries, direction, and key checkpoints, and a few individual points for respawn in case you fall off the track. But before finishing that tutorial, I decided to look around the course settings, and I found that you can change the track image pretty easily. So I grabbed a render in Blender and brought it down to 80 by 96 in Photoshop. Then I used that to generate the course image, which should appear in game next time we test the track. Alright, let's get all those paths and stuff set up. I started with the enemy path. This is just as simple as drawing out a pathway along your track. What's cool though is you can set where the racers should start and stop drifting. Once those nodes have all been placed, and the first and last have been connected, I can just use this option up here to generate the whole item path by just using these same points. Now, enemy racers will know how to race the track, and if I throw a red shell, it'll be able to follow somebody, but I won't be able to complete laps still, and Lakitu is still going to harass me for going in the wrong direction half the time. So let's create the course path. Now you may have noticed that I'm using a top-down view for this, and that's because this is the only view that you can see these points in, because these lap points are vertically ignorant, which sounds like something someone would call you on Twitter, but I just mean that they don't sit at a certain height. They basically just scale forever upward and downward, and this is going to be a big problem. Maybe. I hope not. Maybe we'll just get lucky and everything will work even though it shouldn't. But I'm really skeptical because this track overlaps itself so many times and often in opposing directions. So I'm just going to set up these lap paths and expect to have to redo them later. After a little while, I had the whole course pathed out and had set up key checkpoints as well as linked each lap point to a respawn point. Alright, this is ready to test, but I might as well also try putting some game objects down while we're here, so I set down a few item boxes. But I have to be careful here, I've probably done too much at once. If the game crashes, I won't have any idea what the issue is, so let's launch it and just see what happens. Hey look, the track picture worked. And the game doesn't crash. Lakitu also doesn't seem to be confused about where the track goes, and I flew right through the rail again. Let's try those checkpoints out. Nope. Oh, okay. So I hit a wall here, but not here. And there's another invisible wall. And Lakitu doesn't really want me driving up here. And like I expected, we still can't complete laps. This is bad. The collision issues should be easy enough to iron out, but the lap paths are gonna be a huge undertaking. Because in order to have a clean course that counts laps and doesn't confuse respawn points, we need a model without overlapping paths. And considering we're trying to make a racetrack out of overlap mountain, that's going to be difficult. I put this off for as long as I could, and during the process of procrastination, I actually found out why those pine trees weren't working. It turns out you need to have the game object files inside the course folder if you want the game to load the item. So I found the files for DK Pass and copied over the tree as well as the snowman. Now if I just place a tree and reload the project, we've got an actual tree. So I set trees on each of the tree shadows and angled them towards the track. I also placed a snowman on the bridge, just like in Super Mario 64, but hopefully less wildly frustrating than Super Mario 64. And it looks like the trees and snowman do in fact appear in-game. In trying out a race in Versus, the CPUs are mostly decent at navigating the track, except I'm pretty sure most of them get stuck at this bridge with the invisible wall that you need to jump over. It was pretty cool to sit at the beginning of the race on this snow bridge and watch another racer drive up the ice. It just took a solid minute of sitting here for that to happen, because this is the longest track of all time, which I actually think is pretty cool. But it's not even a track if you can't race on it. So let's get in Blender and see what we can do. The first thing I addressed was that glitchy collision. I flipped backwards normals and raised the end of that bridge up a bit to hopefully clear whatever it's hitting. I also widened that sharp turn some more, which you of course still can't do without slamming into the wall. But the bridge did seem to work better now, and the fences aren't just holographic anymore. Alright, it's time to make some pretty major changes to the model in Blender. The path isn't going to be rerouted or anything, but the proportions of the model are going to have to change pretty drastically to get the lower paths out from under the higher ones. I started by selecting this cliffside section and bringing it all the way out from underneath the snowman bridge section. This needs to look like a simple racetrack from the top-down view and not a bowl of noodles. I carried on with these adjustments. Each one was satisfying, but mostly extremely unsatisfying and gut-wrenching, because while I did my best to select everything necessary before moving anything, there was always damage somewhere that had to be replaced or repaired or restructured. Another consequence of pushing everything outwards is that this track is going to take even longer to race. Not by much, but it's definitely going to be a longer track with this whole spiral being less compressed. Eventually I got to the final section of the track, and realized that an overlap was inevitable right here. But I hoped that if I just kept the actual lap points from interrupting the other bridge's path, it wouldn't cause problems. Well, I think this is it. I'm gonna put down a finish line here as well, which I probably should have done a while ago. But I've got to convert this texture in Nitro Paint first, which somehow has over 2,000 colors. That's about 1,000 times more colors than it needs. But unlike the previous textures I converted, I put this one in the texture 4x4 format, because apparently all of that nonsense I said about using the lowest color palette possible is maybe not true, and Mario Kart DS usually uses this 4x4 format, which is apparently better for performance. So I guess I'll just fix those other textures if I run into performance issues, which I kinda have been, but for now I'll just blame that on some other thing and that isn't my fault and move on. I spent the next 30 minutes or so just repairing sections of the track that I hadn't noticed got messed up when reshaping things. I also had to bring this whole section of the track over since it's overlapping with the final section pretty bad, and pretty much everything over here that wasn't screwed up before was now firmly in the screwed up territory. So I deleted the entire model. Then I quickly remodeled it by pressing Ctrl and Z. Now before we export this, I'm gonna duplicate this dirt path and move it high enough so that it's visible from top down. And I'll do the same for this bridge that leads up to it. That way I can draw an accurate lap path in Mario Kart Toolbox instead of just guessing where the track is without being able to see it. I also had to remake the collision map since the old one is way off now. And when I re-imported everything back into Mario Kart Toolbox, the course paths, enemy paths, item paths, trees, item boxes, pretty much everything needs to be moved, which is what I did with the trees and item boxes, but I just completely deleted and remade the enemy and item path. And setting up the course path was much more enjoyable this time, now that it's a pretty clean path that I actually think could work. But along the way, I came across this part where the rock ledge comes out over the wood path, so I fixed that in Blender, which meant some more deleting and recreating faces. I also may have intentionally left a face out of the collision map and added another glitchy area with a lack of severe polish, or Easter egg as I like to call it. That's much better. Let's get this path finished. Now here's where I want to make sure that the tunnels between the points are completely empty where they intersect. I'm not sure if this will work still, but it's my best bet at not tripping checkpoints above or below where you actually are. Then I set up some more of those snowmen on the bridge, and I even put some on the other bridge below. And let's see what happens. Nope, doesn't work, and the fences are holograms again. So I flipped the fences again, and got to work looking for a reason that the laps still aren't counting. Maybe it's because there's only one checkpoint sitting here. But I made more checkpoints and that still didn't work. But hey, the Easter egg works. You know, I think I'll delete everything on my computer and go die in a cave somewhere. But I pushed on and eventually did come across something super important that I had missed. The first point on the course path is supposed to have a 0 in this start from section, and the last point is supposed to have a 0 on the go to section. Not having those assigned definitely will keep the laps from counting. I just hope that that's the last thing doing so.
Yes! It actually worked.
Finally, this weird glitchy never-ending track actually works enough for me to call it finished. Now you guys probably won't, but for my low standards, this is good enough. And just to make it a little more Cool Cool Mountain, I changed the music from Figure 8 Circuit to, you guessed it, Sherbet Land theme. I'm not changing it to Cool Cool Mountain theme. That is way harder than you might think. I also changed the skybox to the one from DK Pass. There wasn't anything in the tutorial about how to change the skybox, but I noticed that this file has a V in its name, and Nintendo's skybox textures usually have VR in their name, so I just replaced these few files in Figure 8 Circuits folder to the ones from DK Pass, and yeah, that actually worked. Now I didn't update the local map, which kinda sucks, but I couldn't find out how to do that, and you can only switch it over to this global map, which looks really bad, but it's not as jarring as having Figure 8 Circuit on the bottom screen. Well, now it's pretty obvious what I have to do. And it runs just fine. It actually runs way smoother than it did in the emulator. Well, that's gonna do it for Cool Cool Mountain. I'm not sure exactly how I should share this mod, cause I know I can't just share the ROM that I've built. So let me know what the best way is to publish this so you guys can play it. Just don't expect anything fancy and actually functional. It's decently glitchy. Well, I hope you all enjoyed watching. I'll talk to you later. Thanks.